promise this is the last video. Maybe. All right, let's get to our next word, which is Bank of Amsterdam. Bank of Amsterdam was an early bank. It was run by the Dutch government, but it gave out loans to big private companies like the Dutch East Indian Company. So it's a bank for the Dutch in Amsterdam, which we think of today as the Netherlands, and they gave out loans to private companies so they could get more resources. This will be really important with the Dutch East Indian Company. So write that down, Dutch East Indian Company, or the VOC. Basically, this is a private company that goes into Asia and gets a lot of spices and brings them back. Now what happens is the Bank of Amsterdam gives a lot of money to the Dutch East Indian Company and other companies, and this will start them as corporations or businesses, which will allow them to bring a product like all these spices back to cities like Amsterdam and will cause them to get richer. So it's kind of like this is a bank that's run by the government, and they give loans out to private businesses to start up businesses, which go out and take resources from places in East Asia for trade as the Dutch become big-time traders of this era. Lot to go there. Joint stock company. Do your best with this. There'll be some videos on it. A joint stock company is a company where the stock is owned by people who buy shares in it. So basically it's like this. What we saw in this era, let's take that VOC example, the Dutch East Indian Company. Basically, people would see that this Dutch East Indian Company wanted to go and they wanted to travel all the way to Asia and bring spices back. But one person could not afford to get on those boats. So what they did was they found people who had money and they say, hey, would you buy some stock in my company? You can own 5% of the company. And they would sell them that stock and they would say, okay. They would use that money the person gave them for stock to get boats to travel here. And when they came back to Amsterdam, what would happen is if they made a profit, they would have to give that person who bought stock in the company part of their profits. So think of it this way. Someone gives, they buy 10% of the Dutch East Indian Company. They go out here, they bring spices back, all these things back that are worth a lot of money. They end up owning 10% of the profit. So you buy 10% of the company, you get 10% of the profit. What happens if the ships sink? You lose your 10%. So what they did was they got a whole bunch of people together to all spend a little bit of money to buy these ships, to go out and bring spices back to make money. And this was a private company where a bunch of people all bought parts of it. It'd be like today if I want to go and buy part of Apple, which is a company. If Apple makes a profit, I make a little money off that, and I own part of Apple. So a lot of people bought in the Dutch East Indian Company. They invested in it. They put their money into it. And if it made money, they made money. And that is what a joint stock company is. Investors or people invest money into a company, and if it makes money, they make money. Let's look at our next word, mercantilism. Mercantilism was a system that was used by Europeans where they were trying to make money and get more gold. Basically, they would go to their countries that they would conquer in the Americas or in Asia, and many companies would go and they would take, or countries would go, and they would take the resources from this country, bring it back to their land, and make a finished product. For example, they would get tea from India, and then they would bring it here, process it, sell that tea to other parts of the world, and get the profit. They would get wood from the Americas, build ships, homes, all the things they could as finished products here in Great Britain, and then get a lot of money for that. So in mercantilism, you get colonies, you take their natural resources, and you make products from it, and you sell that, and the goal is to get as much gold or as much money as possible. So places like Europe, like Britain would engage in this, France and Spain would engage in mercantilism. And the goal was to sell more of these products to make more money for your empire. You'll be happy to hear there's two more to cross out. Cross out wealth of nations and law of supply and demand. We'll get to those in our next era. It's more about next era, not about this one. And go to East India Company. There were two East Indian companies. One was the British East Indian Company. This was run as a private company. It was a joint stock company, which meant people invested money in this British East Indian Company, and primarily it went to India and brought back tea and spices which they sold. So investors would say, okay, I'm going to put some of my money into this company. They're going to go to India, and they bring back tea and spices, and they'll sell them. I'll get part of the profit because I invested or put my money in it today. Similar, if I was going to put money in Apple stock, for example, and Apple made a lot of money, I would make money. Let's look at our next one, which is, continuing on this, we'll look at the Dutch East Indian Company, or the VOC. And you need to know that the Dutch East Indian Company is also called the VOC. Another private company that people would invest their money, and we talked about a little bit. They went to the East Indies mostly for spices and would bring them back and sell it, and people made profit off this. It led to the Dutch, or people in the city of Amsterdam particularly, becoming very powerful as they went into Asia and got spices. Both of these East Indian companies, by the way, British and the Dutch East Indian Company, even though they were private companies and they weren't run by a country, the country kind of supported them and backed them, and they even had their own militaries, which would become extremely powerful. The British East Indian Company, for example, will pretty much be ruling India, which is incredible to think about. The Third Estate. In France, their parliament was broken up into 3 estates, which all got equal votes. The clergy, members of the church, the nobility, the nobles, the sirs, the people with titles, and the common people. The Third Estate made up more than 90% of the population. However, in Parliament, they only got 1 vote, while the nobles and the clergy also got 1 vote. Not to mention the fact they had this Parliament, it very rarely met, and the king really had absolute or most of the power, which tells you how much power the Third Estate had. Almost none. Also, the First Estate and the Second Estate, the clergy and nobility, paid no taxes. All the taxes were paid by the Third Estate, the poor people who had very little money. This will lead them to get very angry in our next era and cause a revolution in France. The Omani-European rivalry in East Africa and the Indian Ocean. This was a rivalry over trade between the Ottoman Empire and European powers, especially Portugal, Dutch, and the Spanish. Portugal, Dutch, and the Spanish had a rivalry of the Ottoman Empire for trade, which led to battles, which led to wars, and increasingly Europe gained more of an advantage and slowly began to take over the Indian Ocean trade route. By the way, to add to that, because the British East Indian Company, the Dutch East Indian Company, the Portuguese who sail in here, the Spanish who sail here, eventually the Indian Ocean trade route becomes European dominated. First by the Portuguese, then the Dutch come in, and the British gain a foothold into this trade network that was mostly, very different from how it was run in Era 3 from 600 to 1450. 1450 to 1750, by the end of this era, it is dominated by Europeans. Cartography. Like many things in this era, cartography is something that was dominated by the Muslims and Chinese, but especially by the Muslims in the era from 600 to 1450. However, in Spain, with Prince Henry the Navigator, it will become more powerful for the Spanish and the Europeans as they start traveling around Africa, India, and to the Americas. So being able to make maps, cartography is again making maps, will become very powerful for the Europeans as they gain power, as they explore more of the world in this era from 1450 to 1750.